Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Though, this topic may be a bit contentious because while Studio Guru may be indie, today's title was co-developed with Konami. Don't worry, it's not a sexy pachinko machine, I promise. Specifically, I'm here today to talk to you about GetsuFumaDen Undying, a roguelite flavored successor to the original action-adventure game, and that begs the question, did this game manage to eclipse my expectations, or did my interest soon wane? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. The seal upon hell is broken, placing the world under imminent threat of a demonic incursion, and thus, the Getsu clan is called upon once more, to brave those Stygian depths in order to find the source of the calamity and end it. And yet, Fuma must do so alone, for in the wake of this catastrophe, his brother has gone missing. It's a simple enough plot, the likes of which is neatly summed up in the introductory scene, but once that's out of the way, you won't really need to concern yourself too much with narrative developments. On the whole, Undying Moon is a fairly story-light experience, with the central plot only really being explored and resolved when you reach the penultimate stage on normal difficulty or higher, in a cutscene. From there, you've gotten the gist of your hero's story, since while there is an ending, it's more of an odd outro that wound up leaving more questions than answers. To the point that I was legitimately wondering if it was intended as a teaser for future content or a possible sequel. Still, while the central plot is straightforward enough, there are some lore elements to be found, and I don't just mean things like the monster bestiary. In this case, they come in the form of stone tablets located in each stage, which provide a snippet of dialogue that helps to flesh out both the ancestors of the Getsu clan, nameless travelers, and even hellish denizens. While these are brief, they did provide some interesting bits of context about the story as a whole, such as the nature of the Shrine Maidens, or the deep lore of the Getsu clan is probably descended from a monster fucker. Yeah. That said, that is where the optional lore stops, because despite the fact that you can unlock a secondary character, she has no bearing on the plot whatsoever. It's just, you technically have the option to go and talk with her once you're in the hub. It doesn't do anything. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before we talk about Renge, I should focus on the basics. So, Undying Moon is a bit of a different beast from its predecessor. Rather than an action-adventure with RPG elements, this one is an action-adventure with roguelite elements. Simply put, each run starts you at the hub, ready to make a fresh expedition into hell, navigating its various stages and tackling a series of large-scale bosses. That said, it's not long until we begin to notice a difference from some of its roguish peers, especially given their focus on replayability. Simply put, the actual layouts don't really change all that much between the various stages. There is some degree of randomization, but the level layouts stay largely the same, with the primary difference being enemy distribution, including which baddies wind up as empowered elites, and the gear you find. Now, given that enemy types and bosses are always the same for a given area, the randomization of weapons does serve a purpose, forcing you to change up tactics or scouring the stage for a suitable weapon to challenge them. Thankfully, there are some elements that help to further differentiate your runs. For one thing, as you progress through stages, you may be graced with a random key drop, which enables you to permanently unlock an alternate stage to progress through. For instance, instead of braving the Misty Cliffs with its bile-blasting bugs, its enemy-empowering priests, and the vicious Oni twin boss, you could venture into the game's requisite ice level. So this section is incredibly painful, what with a profusion of spikes and gusting winds which complicate platforming, but I far prefer going toe-to-toe with the Ninetales boss. And honestly, those are the sorts of choices I enjoyed making. Tactically choosing between hellish cliffs and a giant centipede, or deciding to deal with corner-guarding water spirits and a giant hydra. As a system, I'd say it's decent enough, though I am looking forward to when it's completed, given that in the game's current 1.0 version, there's a few stages which showcase optional paths, which aren't currently accessible, and since each new stage heralds in a new bestiary, boss, and biome, Yeah. Which, speaking of baddies though, I haven't really talked about combat yet, so pacing-wise, I'd put Undying Moon as a more relaxed title. Sure, the limited healing flasks do provide tension, but attacks are well telegraphed, so getting hit feels deserved. Mostly. Fuck off-screen projectiles and undodgeable sword beams. That said, these are done well enough that the truly bold can take advantage of the existing flash system, where you attack an enemy as they attack, in order to cancel their offensive and deal massive damage in turn. My interest, though, because I was very bad at doing that intentionally, was more in learning the nuances of the various weapon types. Each of these possess a basic combo, a special attack, and an aerial variant for both. Nothing elaborate here, though canceling moves with your dodge and jump or comboing into a special does provide some more meat. Still, they offer some different variety between each other. Long swords, for instance, while all-rounders have the ability to riposte, granting iframes and dealing chunky damage. Whips have great range, but perform optimally by hitting an enemy with the very tip of the attack, forcing you to properly gauge an enemy's position. And then there's just hammers, which, while slow on the ground, especially during their charge attacks, they come equipped with a surprisingly quick and comboable aerial, which pairs really well with another combat staple, Demonization. Essentially, rapidly dishing out consecutive hits builds demon energy, and when you get enough, you demonize, boosting your damage and speed. Conceptually, it's really neat, but there are a couple problems with it. 1. Getting hit or even having debuff like poison cancels it, even if you manage to get to 3 stacks. 2. It'll time out on its own and surprisingly quickly at times, which punishes backtracking, where the speed really shines. And 3, it automatically ends when you kill bosses because reasons. Also, due to it requiring consecutive hits, I found myself reserving my second weapon slot for twin swords, given they demonize faster than anything else, and it was sometimes really hard to get a proper cluster of enemies to build up those combos needed. And it is a lot of fun to be damage and speed boosted, especially when you start whipping out the sub-weapons. Despite the fact that these have limited charges and cooldowns, they fill a sort of unique niche due to their greater variety. Seriously, even within the same sub-weapon tree, these will have very different applications, like doling out status ailments, providing ranged options on low cooldown, and then there's the rifles, which just give fun options like screen-wide piercing shots, exploding AoE bullets, or just massive chonking damage. And that's without getting into both the permanent and temporary progression systems for these things. So, okay, there is meta progression here, so let's get cracking on that. Initially, you really don't have much in the way of unlocked weapons, which plays out somewhat interestingly because it doesn't actually prevent items from spawning. Instead, it disables them from appearing at your base when you unlock additional starting weapons, and it prevents you from seeing their affinities. Sure, they can still be ranked up at a merchant to boost their raw damage if you've gotten gold and dark souls from corpses and recycling weapons. That said, you're not able to discern what the weapon's good at. Like I said, there's sub-weapons that dole out status damage, swords that murder blighted enemies, whips that decimate specific enemy types. Heck, there's even a hammer with a lightning-fast charge paired with an attack and move speed buff. That said, to see that, you need to find the blueprint of the weapon, then craft it with weapon parts, which are gained by recycling gear or as loot, and even then, to really maximize those neat substats once you're actually able to see them and acquire their passives, you'll need to permanently unlock each weapon's skill tree. Now, the former element's already a bit time-consuming, especially when you're only finding weapon parts for things except, say, the rifle parts you need because you finished off everything else and they're just not dropping rifles. That said, the second step is where the grind really peaks, because you need monster parts, and oh boy, I just never have enough of these. Like, I have a metric ton of them in general, but I'm constantly cock-blocked by not having enough of a certain type, even when I go out of my way to murder everything in a stage, buy out every shop, and loop through runs. I just fundamentally lack enough. Easy difficulty is actually sort of nice for this, given that it provides triple gold drops and lets you buy out material shops faster, and yet it felt worth it to engage in this system. Like, yes, activating these nodes is a form of temporary progression limited to that specific run. That said, actually gaining those nodes is satisfying, not only because they enable that potent form of progression, they also permanently change the weapon's substats. Things like a weapon's damage scaling, its capacity to stagger enemies, its reload time, and even the special hammer speed boost I talked about, all of these get permanently modified through this system, which factors into another run-specific form of advancements, Demon Soul modifiers. Demon Souls are a limited currency coughed up by elite enemies, large chests, and boss chests. What makes them useful is each time you spend a soul on main weapon or sub-weapon, it boosts the weapon using its substat modifiers, which is how you do incredibly stupid stuff like this rapid gunfire build. Yeah, just bask in this ridiculous reload time in the sheer damage. Oh, and if that's not enough, how about this rad turbo speed run? This actually drastically changes up the platforming of the game, as while the double jump doesn't really provide much height, the additional speed lets you soar through the air and just bypass segments in really odd ways. I mean, you can get an extra health potion or even boost your health with these too, but there is some serious diminishing returns on health, which is then made worse when you consider just how harsh enemies scale up as you amp up the game's difficulty. And I don't just mean the fact that they get a bit more aggressive or use their full movesets in higher difficulties, nor the fact that the game starts mixing enemies from different biomes to make some really hellish combinations. Now, it just stops mattering at a certain point because they're probably going to one-shot you anyways, or it would were it not for the passive determination mechanic. As long as you're over a certain threshold, you'll just drop to 1 health instead, which makes it viable to get smoked, drink one of your limited potions, and then pray the unseen cooldown on determination ends soon. A strategy which is surprisingly facilitated by the rest of the permanent progression systems, which come in 2 flavors. First off, there's the general upgrade tree, which provides account-wide quality of life options like cheaper shops, more potions, better items, and even healing as you gather gold. Though there is a bit of intrinsic luck involved in this, and also item drop enhancing items, because in order to acquire these, you need to find their blueprints. But their requisite currency is fairly common, and you can even unlock the ability to save a portion of your meta currency after you die, if you don't just prematurely end a run in order to minimize your risks and focus on advancing. The latter is a legitimate option I did a lot when I was starting off. The other form of advancement is character-oriented, and this one's a little bit interesting because, first off, it actually takes a separate form of currency from the global ones. But more importantly, this one's a little bit more grindy, and I don't just mean because you're going and acquiring a second group of blueprints all over again. No, the secondary reason for the grind is the fact that these aren't actually shared between characters, which is then made more painful because Renge, well, okay, so you go through this whole ordeal where you might encounter her as a boss randomly, and you only actually unlock her if you beat her. But here's the thing, her stats are potatoes, except for her speed and stealth. Like, yes, in max difficulty and at her base level, I can progress to the 3rd stage, but it is a painful endeavor because while she's great at maneuvering and kiting, stealth relies on enemies being unaware, which means boss fights drag on and clusters of enemies are suffering, which in turn means I am taking my sweet time in finding the last of Renge's character upgrades because, well, all of the meta upgrades, both character and in general, have an additional tier you can find in the final difficulty. And I'll just stick to Getsu for now. It's a lot less painful suffering. Though I guess it would give me plenty of time to take in the sights, and to Undying Moon's credit, there is an ample amount of sights to see. Its overall art direction is stellar, a delightful homage to ukiyo art, which helps to make every area, every basic enemy, and every boss fight distinct and memorable. In fact, a part of why I'm excited for the new areas is due to my curiosity insofar as how they're even going to portray these places, and what new bosses will be coming in. Also because the current soundtrack is a lot of fun to listen to, and the addition of new tracks is apt to be a treat. Seriously, all the stages have their own unique themes, and a few have some alternate scenes baked in, like the Avenue of Pleasure and Illusion, which has its normal theme, and then its back alley rendition, which it is a treat. And honestly, that brings us to the long and short of things, and ultimately, I did enjoy Undying Moon. Whilst I lack the historical context of playing its predecessor, and I know there is a copy of the untranslated version of the game that comes with getting this game, it's not translated, so no. As a standalone title, I did enjoy myself. Sure, it may not have hooked me narratively, but mechanically, that initial chunk of time where I was finding new weapons to mess around with, figuring out how to optimally use them, and learning the nuances of the biomes and the bosses, it was a lot of fun. But that fun started to ebb as I cycled through very similar runs. On that front, going up in the difficulties did help with longevity, with the differences in enemy setups and their overall lethality forcing me to reevaluate and change my tactics. But even then, it wasn't long before I realized I was just running loops to grind material, praying for the last remaining weapon and fragments I needed, or in excess of monster parts I was lacking. I still lack so many monster parts even after unlocking all of the weapons. Whilst you could consider this an additional reason to squeeze in another run, I found this highlighted another element of the game to me. There's just a lot of stuff that isn't quite in yet. You see all these blank scrolls on the wall? That should give you an idea of how many main weapons, sub-weapons, and skills are yet to come. Each one of those will require a brand new grind. Am I curious about them mechanically? Yes, but I'm already exhausted at the hours of grind they'll entail. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, while I did enjoy my time with the game enough to call it a hit for that initial journey to its current endgame, it's not quite able to sustain that interest, with a lot of my playtime derived more from idle experimentation and stubborn completionism sprinkled with exhaustion. Still, there is an upcoming patch which is going to entail a new difficulty level, monsters, and gear, and with the promise of content beyond that in the form of more stages and characters, maybe I'll encounter something to properly hook me once more. Until then, though, I'd like to say thanks for tuning in. If you agree with me, disagree, or just have something to say, feel free to leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, you can check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlian. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.